So welcome everybody. I'm going to do a very brief introduction. Yeah, could you record there too? We're going to do a very brief introduction. This is Rabbi Herzl Hefter, who teaches in our advanced school, also runs a Beit Midrash in Israel, in Yerushalayim, called Beit Midrash Har'el, really a sister organization for us there in Israel. Rabbi Adam Mintz, who's on our faculty, and also the Rabbi of Akeidah on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. The idea here is that about several months ago, in Parshat Vayera, Rabbi Hefter published a piece on the Akeidah on the Lair House website. If you haven't seen that website, I would highly recommend just checking it out. There's a lot of interesting Torah on that site. And it's really a provocative way to think about what it means to sort of live a religious life in the 21st century, given the nature of the radical opportunity of choices that we have. And so we're going to have these two scholars kind of thinking about and talking about Rabbi Hefter's approach to the Akeidah.
Thanks, Jeff. Welcome, everybody.
Thank you.
Welcome, Rabbi Hefter.
Okay, thank you very much.
So I think we'll start with Rabbi Hefter. If you could just kind of give us some background, what led you to write the article, and what are the kind of the basic points in the article, and we'll take it from there.
Yeah. All right. I'll talk about, summarize what I wrote, and then I'll give you some background about why I was driven to write about it. Basically, there are two approaches, globally speaking, to the Akeidah. What's called the problem of hearing and the problem of choice. The more traditional way, or the common way of looking at it, is the problem of choice. Namely, Abraham Avinu was given a choice by God, and the test is, what will he choose? Okay? And then, of course, he passes the test when he represses his love for his son. He represses his his refined moral sense, the abolition or the suspension of the moral in favor of the religious. That's the problem of choice that he has, right? The other possibility is talking about it in terms of the problem of hearing. The problem of hearing is, Zohar is the best source for that idea, that says, Vayar et hamakom merachok, he perceived the place from afar. Hamakom is like a reference to God. That's how the Zohar reads it. This is like the omnipresent, hamakom. So it says, Vayar et hamakom merachok, he saw God from afar. That means the command of the Akeidah, the Zohar says, is about aspaklaria de'ena me'ira. It was through an unclear glass. In other words, it wasn't clear what God was saying to him. And that is the problem of hearing. How does he know that it's God telling him to sacrifice his son? Right? And that's what the whole Akeidah is about, is how does he come to the conclusion, and what is the religious meaning of coming to that conclusion? Now, I think that that's very important as an alternative to the first way, because there are all these negative consequences of the first reading, which puts front and center the whole idea of submission to authority as the centerpiece of what it is to be a religious Jew. And I think that even though there's some truth to that, it is also potentially very damaging, and we live the damaging consequences of that, of the narrative being read that way. Okay? And what drove me to write about it, I've been thinking about it for a long time, is you hear people saying, whenever there's some sort of problem, it's an aguna problem, it's her Akeidah. Someone is a homosexual, so what do? It's his Akeidah, right? Everybody has the Akeidah. I know, you're making faces, but this is what people say, right? I don't know if people around you say this, but people say this, right? You hear this. When I wrote my piece about why I gave smicha to women, and I talked about following an intuitive side after you've consulted and after you've thought about it, and I made it into a theological point of being able to rely at some point on refined intuition based on Beirur, based on clarifications. So somebody wrote a piece invoking the Akeidah, that you see that you can't go, that's the answer. The Akeidah is that you cannot rely on what you think is right. God tells you what's right, right? So I said, okay, I really have to address the Akeidah as part of this thing. So what really made me address the Akeidah is the type of things that are going on here. right? And what's going on in my Beit Midrash in Yerushalayim, right? That what's the Akeidah is the binding of Isaac at God's command, right? So what made me address that is the tension that exists between people's refined intuitions, which are conditioned by modernity, as opposed to what is perceived to be what the Torah tells people and what the Halacha tells people. How do you navigate that? Right? And the Akeidah, like women's smicha, is an instance of that problem, right? But not the issue itself, as important as those issues are. Right? But they're instances of a much bigger issue, is how does the Torah navigate modernity, and in the most particular sense, when I say talk about modernity, is where people are taught to rely upon themselves and make autonomous choices. That is what modernity, that's what characterizes modernity, that people have choices. People can choose almost anything today. You can choose what sex you want to be, right? That's a pretty big choice that people didn't have open to them years ago. So how do you navigate that? With the Torah, with this authority that tells you this is right, this is wrong. So that's the background behind why I wrote what I wrote.
Okay, so let's take it. There are two. Take it on two levels. One is what you said about the Akeidah, and the second is how you built it up and you expanded it beyond that. The first thing I want to discuss with you is you mentioned the submission model. Let me just clarify for everybody that in Lair House there was a response by Rabbi Tzvi Sineski. Rabbi Tzvi Sineski is a young Talmud teacher, what we used to call the Rebbe, in Kohelet High School in Philadelphia. And he wrote a response which really supported the submission model. And you're welcome to read it and look at it, and it's an interesting response. So I guess what I want to kind of explore with you is, what's the role of that submission model? Meaning, when it's not an all, it can't be an all or nothing. The question is, where is their submission first in the Akeidah? You know, is part of the explanation submission, or you think that it's all choice? And then based on that, the way you expanded the idea of choice, how can we expand the idea of submission to try to make that relevant today also?
That's a mouthful of a question.
We can break it up in half if you want.
A little piece. Okay, I'll submit to your question. Submission does have an important role in religious experience. So when Avram stands before God and says, there's a sense of the nothingness of the human being standing in the face of God. But I think it's a misreading of the Akeidah, because the Akeidah assumes that Avram Avinu is going to do it. That does not seem to be the struggle. And what we have to realize is that it's not considered, this might be shocking, right? The introduction of morality into the question of the Akeidah, when it's totally absent from the Torah, right? The Torah knows, right, in the story of Sodom, Avram Avinu invokes some sort of naturalistic moral argument against God, right? But that's not the story of the Akeidah. The Torah knows how to talk about morality, but that's not the story in the Akeidah. The assumption in the case of the Akeidah is that Avram Avinu is going to do it. That's not the question, right? Because it's not considered immoral to kill your son if God tells you to. That is the morality of the Bible, because they see individuals differently. They see it's not immoral if God tells you. The person who wrote this is the master of Pshat. Rav Mordechai Breuer wrote this in Pirkei Breshit, right? In his book, which he talks about the Prakim and Sefer Breshit. So it's not immoral per se. So that's not the issue. The moral problem, when you said it's terrible, right? The moral problem is not between Avram Avinu and God. It's between you, who's reading the story, and the story. You have to place the moral problem where it belongs in terms of the Akeidah. It's between me and the Torah. It's not between Avram Avinu and God. It's still a problem, but it's not a problem that Avram Avinu has with the Akeidah, right? So that's the first thing. So submission is important because, look, theologically, we don't experience God as only within ourselves. There has to be some sort of transcendent element. There's a voice outside, right? To which ultimately you have to submit. The question is, what is it that you submit? I can submit to things which are uncomfortable for me, which can be very difficult for me. But to say that you should submit your morality or submit the love for your family because there's an outside command, that I don't think is the message. That I don't think is the message of the Akeidah. It's because it's not Avram Avinu's issue, right? Avram Avinu is sensing this has to do with how you understand prophecy and how God communicates to people, which is part of what I wrote about. I can expand about that here, but it's actually good to start with the Rambam. Instead of starting with Kabbalah and Hasidus, it's actually good to start with the Rambam, right? People feel more secure with the Rambam because they don't know what the Rambam said. Once you find what the Rambam said, you won't feel secure with the Rambam either. But the Rambam views prophecy as sort of a naturalistic occurrence. In other words, it's built into the way God made the world that people have the capacity, because they created B'Tselem Elokim, they have the capacity to comprehend God. Right? And the more refined the human being is, the Rambam's method of refining might be different than other people's method of refining, but the more refined a person is, the more they can perceive what God is saying. So in a sense, like if you put it in Darwinian terms, like the ultimate evolution of humanity is to be a Navi. To be fully human is to be a Navi. Right? That's the Rambam. Right? That's the Rambam, the rationalist, right? So the Kiviyachol, not really a rationalist, but so the Rambam thinks that that's just the way the world is. So if you refine yourself and you're moral and you're ethical and you learn and you understand the world, you'll ultimately understand what God is saying. Because God is always broadcasting. This is very similar to Hasidus. God is always broadcasting, and the question is whether you have the correct frequency and you hear it. Right? That's the Rambam on Nevuah, right? An extension of this, I'm not saying the Rambam would agree with what I'm about to say now, right? But an extension of this it means that prophecy, a person being a prophet, is conditioned by their circumstances, because it has to do with who you are and what type of challenges and circumstances you're facing. And that's going to be how I interpret what God is telling me, because I'm only as good as I am, right? So then you have to look back and look at the story of Avram Avinu and say, what could it be that he's responding to? But ultimately, if it's a natural phenomenon, that means God is ultimately speaking to you through you. And that can happen in two different ways. It can happen that this is what you desire, and then you attribute that desire and understanding to God as a matter of faith, right? It's always dangerous, right? But that's one way. Or you hear the voice of God as if it's external from you. But I say as if because think about it as the voice of conscience. You want to do something. So you have this idea that you want, right? That's one thing. And then there's a little voice in your head that says, no, you really shouldn't do that, right? So Freud will tell you it's the internalization of the superego that you got from your parents. That's fine, right? But that's an experience of an external voice, but that experience of an external voice is somewhat misleading because that voice is also internal. So there are two types of internal voices. There's the internal voice where there's no subject-object, which is you, right? And then there's the internal voice, which you experience as external, okay? But that's all, right? So the question is, that's all coming from God. That's a matter of faith, right? Depending on how refined you are. So Avram Avinu has these different voices inside of him, which he's trying to figure out what is it that God wants. Submission is important to the extent that you have to open yourself up to be able to hear, to make sure that it's not you. That's where the uncertainty comes in. That's the aspaklaria she'ena me'ira, the unclear glass that I don't know whether this is God or maybe me. So I have to look, so it's to figure it out. You have to look inside. So what are my interests? What do I want? Right? What's my stake in this?
So that's really interesting. The idea that you have to be submissive to allow yourself to make the decision,
to absorb the whole thing.
Yeah, to absorb the whole thing, and therefore to come to a realization of what you really want, and to recognize what's God and what's you, and what's a good inclination and what's a bad inclination.
Right. So that's an arduous process of introspection.
And would you say that the history of Jewish religion or Jewish religious observance is really the fear of what that what the submission ultimately leads to in terms of our recognition about ourselves, and therefore the easier way to deal with it is just to submit and then to end the story there?
There's a okay. Yes. Go ahead. Next question. Look, there's a inherent tension, right? Which between, you could say, you can call it exterior religion, which is expressed through religious institutions that have authority, right? And interior religion, where it has to do with the personal relationship with God and how you perceive God and how you perceive yourself and all these things that we're talking about, right? So there's a move from, like when you read the Torah and you read Melech and Navi and Beis HaMikdash, so these are all external institutions, right? To institutions outside of human beings. And then you talk about Karol Bilvavcha Lasoto and Kotvei Maluchot Libecha, and there's this, and Sefer Tehillim, and Libi Halal B'Kirbi. So then you're talking about some internal experience of religion, and there's this general back and forth between those two things, right? William James is very important for that reason, right? He placed religion in terms of the heart because he was a good Protestant, right? And in a sense, we're all Protestants. But so that's a movement that goes back and forth. There's a very good story. We didn't talk about this before, but if you read the Brothers Karamazov, do you remember the story of the Grand Inquisitor? This is a great story. The story of the Grand. It's a short story within a story, right? The Grand Inquisitor the whole thing is a monologue of the Grand Inquisitor. It's set in medieval Spain. Do you know this? Do you know the story? Medieval Spain, Jesus comes back, right? And being Jesus, he heals the sick, he feeds the poor. He has this divine charisma, right? So people start following him, right? And he's hauled in front of the Inquisition. And the whole thing is the speech of the Grand Inquisitor. And the Grand Inquisitor says to him, I know who you are. And the whole thing, Jesus is just looking upon him lovingly, right? Because that's what he does. So he says, I know who you are, and he explains to him why he's going to burn him at the stake. Because you came to the world to free men, but we know that freedom is dangerous, and we've built the church upon your blood. And to preserve that, we have to burn you at the stake. And they burn Jesus at the stake. The Inquisition kills Jesus the second time. Okay? That's the story of the Grand Inquisitor. But he really captured the tension that exists between institutionalized religion and why institutionalized religion has an innate, you talked about fear, has an innate fear of authentic religiosity, because authentic religiosity in the presence of God, like that's the fire of Nadav Avihu, right? You have that story also, right? You have the fire of Nadav Avihu in the presence of God. There aren't any institutions. I was very close with Rav Gorelik in YU. So he once said, I was at his house for Shabbos, and Brisker, he was a Talmud of the Brisker Rav. So he didn't go to shul on Shabbos. He didn't daven b'tzibur. So I was a little shocked that he didn't daven b'tzibur on Shabbos. So it was like Shabbos morning. So he said, Ani v'hu, I'm mechaya. That was his reaction, right? So that's the tension. It's an inherent tension. You can't throw out institutions because you have to apply the religiosity in society in an orderly fashion, right? But then the institutions have this innate fear of people doing things authentically. But what do you mean? You didn't ask me what to do. But there was no time because I'm driven, right?
So we did discuss this a little beforehand, and one thing you said, which I want to talk to everybody about, is the idea of what we like to call slippery slope, right? We're all familiar with slippery slope. You're not allowed to do this because you're afraid of the slippery slope. Right? That has to do with institutional religion, right? You can't, don't start because it's going to lead to mixed dancing. And last night, what you said
You left
was,
out the you left
right,
yeah.
I understand,
That's bad.
right? What we talked about last night was the fact, you said something which I thought was really important, and that is, there's a risk of slippery slope, but there's also a risk of not doing it, right? Meaning that you're afraid of what might come if we start sliding down the slope, but there's an equal risk, maybe a greater risk, if we don't take that chance. And really the tension, this is what you're talking about, another way to say the tension is the tension between being afraid of falling off the cliff and being afraid of not climbing to as high as we can go.
It's not only not see, even the way you frame it, it's like not flying as high as we can go. So it's no, okay, so you made it halfway, nicht gefährlich.
That we have an
Right?
obligation to
But if
climb
you don't,
that high.
but it's not only in terms of obligation. That if you stay where you are, there'll be an earthquake, and there won't be a mountain, and there won't be a cliff, and you'll wind up the same place, right, or worse. In other words, there's no real safe option. There's an illusion, right, just like in Middle Eastern politics, right, that the status quo is okay, right? But Heraclitus was right that the only thing that's constant is change, right? That was that you can't step into the same river twice, and some people say you can't even step into the same river once. Right? That was so because the only thing that's constant is that things are changing, and so there's no real safe option. People want to feel safe by keeping it the same, and you're taking a chance if you try to change things. But it's just as hazardous. The question is like who you're looking at and where you're seeing the hazards. If 90% of the Jewish people do not identify with Torah and mitzvahs, that is an earthquake, right? So then you could say, well, I want to be safe. I'm going to preserve the 10%. But you're lose the 90%, and what's going to happen to the other 10%? So the 10%, so by natural growth of large Haredi families, you'll always have some, and then the rest will, right? So it's just as hazardous. I have a friend who's a Breslov Chassid. He said that life, he used to be like a kung fu champion before he became from. He said life is an extreme sport.
So that's what I wanted to talk about. You know, we all grew up, whatever age you are, we all grew up with the idea that modern Orthodoxy was a safe middle, right? Now, that's a special, I think that everybody, at least in America, is very sensitive to that idea of the middle, if I'm allowed to say, since Election Day. Meaning that kind of we're not talking politics, we're just talking about the fact that it seems like the middle's fallen out, right? Everybody's extreme. It doesn't matter which way you are. You're extreme this way, you're extreme that way. But kind of what we like to think of as the sane middle. And the sane middle in politics and the sane middle in religion are connected. Means it's a type of personality that looks for the sane middle. And what I hear you suggesting is, and I think this is interesting, and I'm not quite sure what to do with it, is the idea that the sane middle is risky, and that what we really need to do is that we need to choose an extreme, right? Life's an extreme sport. And that we can't be satisfied with what we call the sane middle, because we're going to be standing, because there's an earthquake and we're standing in the same place, we're going to fall in. It means we can't have that sane middle. And I guess what I'm worried about or wondering about, and let's talk about Yeshivat Maharat for a minute, just to talking about what I know a little bit, and that is, so the question is, how do you, to use our term, how do you brand Yeshivat Maharat? So what I hear you suggesting is that it's okay, Yeshivat Maharat can be branded as an extreme, because life's an extreme sport. If you stay where you are, you're gonna fall in. So therefore, it's okay. We're taking, we're taking that position, which is an extreme position, and maybe that's the
Extreme is in the eyes of the beholder.
Yeah, no, I'm saying, and that's what I'm saying, and maybe that's the emes. Branding is something else, which is like you talked about how we look at Chumash. So I'm wondering about how within the community your presentation, and I see that Rabbi Sinesky, he responds when it's the Akeidah, but obviously he would respond even stronger if we were listening to this conversation, I would imagine.
Well,
So
no, I don't want to talk about it. He's not here.
yeah, no,
so-
but you know what I mean. Means that kind of position, we respond. And I'm just wondering about how you see your presentation in the broader context, in terms of religious energy now, in terms of how that works with the way we've kind of been brought up in terms of that same middle. I mean, so to say it's very specifically, are you rejecting the sane middle, or are you saying that this needs to be worked within the sane middle? And I guess what I'm asking is, given everything, I'm worried in America, and it's going to affect Orthodox and Jews and everybody, that our job may be going forward to recreate a middle that somehow is disappearing. And I wonder whether when we think about Yeshivat Maharat, and we think about something that has been portrayed as being more extreme, what the role of something like some of the more extreme, more personal expressions of religion can be used in terms of recreating the middle. It means maybe what we have is a new definition. You say life's an extreme sport, but maybe what we want to do is we want to redefine the middle. And maybe what you're talking about is not really an extreme sport. Maybe what you're talking about is really a middle. But in 2017, maybe the middle is different than when we went to school, however many years ago together, what we thought was the middle was one thing, and in 2017 is not the same thing. And I think that maybe that's somehow, and again, it's in the eyes of the beholder. Maybe it's in the eyes of how everybody looks upon us, but maybe it's important for us too to see where do we fit in those extreme versus middle.
You're right.
If I can put it in my 2 cents.
I take issue with some of your terminology.
Okay.
Okay. Sane. Okay. Sane could also be, the way you're using it, could also mean bland. It could also mean mediocre. Right? I'm not saying, right?
No, and
but-
scared.
And scared. That the concern
All the
comes
above.
right. The concern, right? The concern comes through. I think that the fact that, as you put it, the middle, I won't call it the sane middle. Okay. You can call it the boring middle, right? You can call it the middle, and you can pick your own adjective.
Are you saying same or sane?
Sane. He was saying sane.
I was saying sane.
As in insane.
Yeah, as the opposite of insane, right?
Yeah, I think insane would capture it better, actually. The insane middle, okay? Let's put it this way. The middle, right, without judging the middle, right? The fact that the middle has fallen out, as you put it, and I agree with that diagnosis, okay, should give all the people who are like flowing through space, right, and when it fell out, as it's falling out, should give people pause and to think about what it is that needs to be reconstructed in its place, right? To say, let's recapture the middle and find a new, stronger centrist orthodoxy, right? Like, let's do it stronger, right? Let's do more Torah and Mada, right? Let's teach women the way we taught men, right? Like, that's all really good. It's so 20th century, right? There's something else happened, right? So don't call it sane or insane. It seemed reasonable to a lot of people for a time. It seemed reasonable, right? But what gets difficult is, why can't it be passed on? Why is there difficulty in passing it on to the next generation, where people either become not frum or they become Haredi? Like, what is it? Why is it? So maybe there's something. Look, you have to be tolet achisaron b'cha, right? You have to say, so what is it about me? Where did I go wrong? It's not like, oh, the Haredim captured Kiruv and they did this, and I'm fine, except nobody listens to me, right? There has to be some sort of introspection about why this middle fell out. And I think, I'll tell you, like, my 2 cents, right, is that the problem is that, if you talk to us here in America, right, the problem in America is that modern Orthodoxy was founded by Litvaks. And it was, they had the intellectual, particularly the Rav, right? So they had the intellectual power to make Judaism palatable to people in America in the 1950s and the 1960s with a language which was relevant to them, right? But 2017 is not 1965, it's not even 1975. There are different issues. The difference of how people view themselves in terms of their identity, in terms of the challenges, in terms of men and women, in terms of sexuality, in terms of Zionism, in terms of the Palestinian conflict we have with Palestinians. All these things, people don't look at them the same way, even if they're the same issues, but they're framed differently. So there has to be a new way of dealing with it. You call it middle, call it extreme. You have to navigate the rapids. You have to generally go in the middle, right? It's just a risky business, but that's the world we live in. There's no alternative. So I don't like calling it sane or insane. It was reasonable to people in the 1950s and the 1960s where it was important to argue about whether you should have Torah Umada, right? So that was an argument that they had in the 1950s, 1960s. So do people argue about that anymore? It's blasé. I mean, if you don't want to read Dostoevsky and study philosophy, so don't. I don't care. Like, just don't bother me, right? That's like, they're not arguing. I don't argue with people in Bnei Brak about studying philosophy, right? I don't argue with them about Zionism anywhere anyway, because they've given into Zionism, and Zionism has changed. So, like, there's a Haredi Sar in the government. Akeidah would never do such a thing before, right? So things change. Right? So you need some new way of looking at it. And I think the key is the process of interiorization. I think, now this might not be true in 100 years from now, but right now, the way human self-perception has developed is that things are valuable. We come to view ourselves as interior beings. Like, how do I feel about this? There's like, you feel yourself as opposed to the world. There's a very high consciousness of self. That did not exist in the time of the Torah. People were part of a tribe, people were part of a nation. That's why you can have genocide, because they're all guilty, right? That's why you can kill Amalek, but you don't look at them as individuals, right? It's not, you couldn't imagine such a thing today. You couldn't, right?
I couldn't agree with you more. I guess what I'm troubled by is how your view can impact even the small little community that we have. So let's go back to 1965 for a minute, the 1955. The reason, and we agree on this, the reason the Rav was successful is because it was a generation of refugees. Okay. And he told them, he as the Talmud Chacham from the Soloveitchik family, told them, you can be an intellectual, you can be a professional, you can have Torah, you can have Mata, you can have Torah. That spoke to them. It's blasé, it's boring, it's ancient history. We won, right? That's not right. It's the end. But the language of the Rav, and it's so interesting. I don't know how many of you do this. I'm sure not many of you. If you listen to a shir of the Rav, just once, to listen to the way the Rav spoke, he doesn't speak to us anymore. If you listen to a lecture of the Rav, he doesn't speak to us anymore, because the issues that the Rav was talking about, what he was trying to convince people of, are so taken for granted. Like you said, who cares if you learn philosophy? That's not the issue, right? We don't talk those issues anymore. So my problem is like this. What the Rav was successful in was creating a community around that philosophy. And because of that, he was able to strengthen an orthodoxy, and we'll talk about something else now, that basically was lost to the conservative movement. See, that was the chiddush. The victory of the Rav was not in having people read Moreh Nevuchim. The victory of the Rav was he made sure that the people didn't become conservative. He created modern orthodoxy. Now, you're not creating a movement, but it's important when we talk about 2017 versus 1965, that community that was the second and third generations that from 1965, what are they looking for now? And what's going to speak to them as a community means that's my bottom line. What's going to speak to them as a community? How can we make this language accessible to them?
I think the first thing is that you have to be real. In other words, you have to be honest. People can't stand dishonesty, and it's a chil Hashem where dishonesty comes from, emanates from the Torah. So you have to be able to say the truth, right? If you believe in giving women smicha, so then give them smicha and call them rabbi, right? Because all the semantic, this is just an example, right? The semantic twists that people do, they're calling, I'm sorry, right? Calling them this, and we're not going to let them do this, but they can do this. Like, why are you tying yourself into a pickle? For what? Because you don't want to get certain people downtown upset. So then you lose credibility, and in the sense that they're doing something real, right? I've been here this week, and it's great, and we're doing something real. We're doing something real together. Doing it in Israel. But you have to do it real in a way that people understand it, and that you show that you're not embarrassed about it, and that it's l'chatchila, that's the way it has to be, right? So I think that speaks to people if you're truthful about it, right? The people that are going to be against you are always going to be against you. Ain't ma lasot, right? You're gonna, right? But the people that should be for you, they can't be enthusiastically for you if they think, okay, so we have to say, call it this, we have to call it that. And that's just the case in point. You have to be able to say what you think and have faith in the Torah, that the Torah can handle it. You have to be able to say that they're really problematic parshiot in the Torah, and Amalek is really a big problem. Like my parents are both Nisolei Shoah. If I had nuclear weapons, would I kill every German on the face of the earth now? Right? Everybody? How bad was Amalek? They weren't as bad as the Nazis. Let's say they were as bad as the Nazis, right? Let's say, right? It couldn't have been worse, right? I don't think if my parents had nuclear weapons, they would have used it on all the Germans, right? So you have a mitzvah in the Torah to kill everybody, right? So what is that? So that's a problem. That's called a problem, right? And that's a problem between, not in the Torah. The Torah doesn't think that it's a moral problem. But between you and the Torah, you have to locate the problem. That's a problem. And to be honest about it. That has to do also with the slippery slope. I don't know the answer to that. I mean, I have a way of thinking about it, right? But I don't know I don't have a total answer for that, right? Or I don't have an answer that would satisfy people here. But anyway, but the slippery slope, I don't know first of all, I don't know what the bottom of this mysterious slippery slope that goes into the sunset. I don't know what's at the bottom of that slippery slope. Like, what are you afraid? Like you joked about mixed dancing. So it's mixed dancing, and I can live with it, right? So if it's the disappearance of the Jewish people, and and everybody's going to go, marry to get into marriage. If that's the bottom of the slippery slope, so let's talk about why you think this is why you think women rabbis or something else is going to lead to, I spoke to a woman in Efrat about women learning. She said she learns, and she said, what are they afraid of? She said, they're afraid I'm going to stop having children. Like, what are they afraid of? Is it the end of the family, right? It's like, is that, like, people, if a woman gets smicha, the women here, right? You're not going to have children. You don't want to have children because you want to sit and learn and not have children. Like that, I don't think that's an issue for most people, right? And if it is, it's an issue just as much for men as it is for women, right? So, like, what are you afraid of? So look at the bottom of the slippery slope. Like, because again, embrace the fear. What is it that you're afraid of? The people talk, they're afraid. So what are you afraid of? What is it? Like, you're afraid that women are getting aliyahs on Torah? What are you afraid of? And what's going to happen if that happens? God forbid, right? What's going to happen? I don't know. So then you say, okay, but maybe there are some things I don't know about. Right? You have to be open to things I don't know about. But this has to do with the fact is that if I do nothing, I also lose all these things I don't know about. Or maybe I know better. I know that the Jewish people are, like 90% of the people don't identify the Torah and think it's a joke. If they think about it at all.
So we know what the bottom of the slippery slope is, and that's why we won't listen to authority, right? It's the institutions versus the personal Judaism that you talked about a little while ago. Let's argue that for a minute. Let's say, forget we know. Let's argue for a minute that the bottom of the slippery slope is that there'll be independent decision-making and that we won't be bound by the authorities, by whoever the halachic authorities are, or by the halachic institutions. And that's, for them, risky, and therefore they don't want to start on a process that could lead to that, because they see that as the undoing of the halachic system. So the question I have is, what's the response to that? is the response, you see, the response to that isn't that authority figures have no role at all, because obviously authority figures have a role. But the question is, how can we help reshape, rethink, talk about 2017 versus 1965, how can we help rethink authority figures so that they don't have to be afraid of what the bottom of the slippery slope is?
So it has to do with the theory of knowledge, right? Because what do people know? How do they know it, right? And this does connect also to the problem of hearing, and it goes back to the Akeidah. There's a really good phrase by Rav Nachum of Chernobyl, right? The great grandfather of Professor Yitzhak Tursky Alav Shalom. So he said the Torah is an aspaklaria. The Torah is a mirror. And you see yourself. If you're a good person, then you find the beautiful and good things in the Torah. And if you're an evil person, you find the evil there. And that's what it means when we talk about Sam Hamavet. This is a very postmodern idea, because it's all interpretation. Now, you have to interpret. We come from an interpretive tradition. And things that are usher in the Torah, we somehow found ways to make them entirely mutter, right? Entirely mutter, as if the Isser didn't exist in the first place, right? So, through an interpretive process. But when you have an interpretive process, you have to acknowledge that the interpretation is only as good as the person doing the interpreting, right? So of course, somebody has to do the interpreting, and it's not a free-for-all interpreting. There's a tradition of interpretation that makes for continuity, right? Now, you need the continuity, right? You need it socially, but also religiously, it has to do with how you see God revealing himself through the people, through some sort of continuous historical process. Okay? All that said, so there is a tradition of interpretation and people listening to the interpretations of those who are wiser. Okay? I accept all that, and that's very important, right? But it has to be experienced as that, and not a phrase you used earlier, right? That this is the emes, right? There has to be, that's a very naive thing. And this is, I think it's part because of the Rav and Plato, right? That there's an emes out there that the Chacham is mechaving to, and he uncovers it and he tells you what it is, right? That is nobody thinks that anymore, right? I think from Kant, that you don't have access. If there's such a thing, you don't have access to it, and you don't know if there's such a thing. Through interpretation, you create what there is. So let people interpret through the way people interpret. But once you understand that it's a human process of interpretation, which by virtue of faith, you attribute the beginning of that chain to God in whichever way you understand that, so that makes you relate to the interpreters different, and it does undermine absolute authority, and that can still get them nervous.
It's worse than that. The minute that there's no emes, rejecting authority is personal.
Okay.
And I think that they understand.
It's like the Godfather.
That.
Everything
Correct.
is personal.
That's right. Meaning, I think even though the authorities wouldn't admit to understanding that, they might present what they say as emes, but ultimately they understand it. You see, if the authorities presented emes, if they actually believed it was emes, and I rejected their emes, they wouldn't take it personally. Meaning that's between me and HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That's okay. There's an emes out there, right? Plato says there's an emes, and I rejected it. Doesn't affect the authority figure at all. They're much smarter than that. They understand that there's no. They present it as emes, but they know it's not emes, and therefore when they're rejected, it's hugely personal. Now this is an interesting. It's an interesting thing.
I'm not sure. Okay.
Whatever.
Let's say.
It's interesting though to go back and to see where that was 100 years ago and 200 years ago. But let's say now. Let's throw that out as a possibility, right? That it becomes very personal to reject authority figures. You see, what we really need to do is, I think, to create part of this rethinking the 21st century is really rethinking authority figures. Because what you're presenting is the fact that authority figures are very important. That's the interpretive tradition. If you don't have authority figures, the interpretive tradition kind of falls away.
But when you understand its interpretation, the emphasis moves away from their authority towards their
But there
interpretation.
still has to be authority figures who are, what you call them, wiser in their interpretation. Meaning that even within the interpretive model, the idea of being wiser is important. Now, that is not the...
But how do you, okay, then what criteria do you
So that's what I'm
use?
saying. That is not the authority figures that, for lack of a better, image, that American Orthodoxy has. And because American Orthodoxy doesn't have these kinds of authoritative figures, so therefore, what your model presents is, it's kind of an all or nothing, meaning rejecting your model, going back to the authoritative model and accepting what the authoritative figures say, or completely rejecting them for the 21st century model that you present. There's no middle road. Now that might be okay, but what I'm saying is, because that's the alternative, therefore to reject them leaves us without a group of authoritative interpreters. And I think that people, both because the interpretive process respects people who are wiser, and because the tendency
Because I don't
of
think
people...
that's true. I think that people...
You're always going to look to wiser.
No. Yeah, that is true. But the not having, like you're saying, how do we live without, like the emperor has no clothes.
Right.
So how we have, right? So what do
do
we
you
do?
do you need an
But I
emperor?
think the people in this room probably realized for a while that the emperor has no clothes.
But
Right.
the people
so
in this room
how do the
miss
people? How do the people
emperors.
here? I assume everybody daven chakras here, right? Everybody daven chakras this morning, right? And people keep kosher homes, and people are still committed to their families and to their communities. And how do they do that if the emperor has no clothes? How do you do that without the gedolim, right? It's been a long time since, right, people in the middle that caved in for other reasons, right? They didn't cave in because they didn't look to gedolim, right? But I think we live without that for a long time, because there's a sense, and this has to do with something else, that there has to be a healthy sense of autonomy. There's this thing that, partially because I think of the Rav, that the less sense, this is not what the Rav thought, but or almost a corruption of what the Rav thought, or taking to an extreme, is that the less sense something makes, the more frum it is. And you prove how frum you are by doing things that are totally ridiculous, because the only reason you would do them is because God told you to, because if you're just doing it, right? So you prove how frum you are by how crazy you are, right? I'll tell you, a few minutes, I'll tell you a story. My wife, Batya, when she was, she comes from a Reform background, and when she was becoming frum in Yerushalayim, she was like speaking to people, and so she studied philosophy in college, and she was in these Haredish places where they're trying to make her frum, and she came to Israel, she thought that from people, they have the answers to the questions because they're religious, they know something I don't know, right? So she's coming to hear what they have to say. And they would make these arguments. She would say, but this contravenes Aristotle's seventh argument about fallacious arguments. So they would keep bumping her up to talk to other people. And finally, she came and she spoke to she doesn't know who the guy's name is, some big Rav, right? Sitting across the table. And he started talking to her, and she asked him some questions. And he got up and he banged on the table. She was like shocked. She was 20 years old. She was like shocked. And he said, "Do you think we would do this if God didn't tell us to?" She got up and she walked out, right? It's amazing that she's frum after that, right? But that's the underlying assumption, that there's how do you show that the Torah is from God? By saying it doesn't make any sense. That is so Christian. And that's the church, right? It doesn't make sense. It's absurd, and that's because C.S. Lewis in The Problem of Pain. He has this proof that God exists. I love C.S. Lewis, but listen to this proof that God exists. Tell me what you think about it, okay? He says, the idea that there's a supreme, all-powerful being that is moral and good goes against all empirical evidence. If you just look at the world, right? If there's a supreme being that's all-powerful, he's not good. And if there's a power that's good, it's not all-powerful, right? So the fact that people believe this shows that, like, God exists, because nobody would think about that themselves. So God put that's proof that God exists, because otherwise nobody would think about it themselves, right? So believe in God because it makes absolutely no sense at all. I love C.S. Lewis. And I like The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and there's other stuff they wrote, but that's crazy, right? But you have that in the Haredi world, that that when things don't make sense, that shows that it's from God. But that's against what the Torah says. Am chacham v'navom. The goyim will look, not only Briskel Amdonim will say this makes sense, that the chiluk makes sense, that the goyim will look and say that the chiluk makes sense, right? So that has to do with things making sense, and you have to be able to rely. Ein hadavar talui el habi. You're ultimately responsible. You cannot abrogate responsibility and say the Gedolim said. Right? You have responsibility to evaluate what people are saying, what they're doing, and what you think can be done, with humility at the same time, and you don't understand everything, so then you have to learn. It puts a lot of responsibility on the individual, and that is the flip side of freedom. Real freedom of choice comes with responsibility. So responsibility means to understand, to know, to learn, to interact, to discuss. There aren't shortcuts. And that and you can have a community formed around that type of dialogue and that type of activity.
Do you see this true in halacha, in like practical halacha as well? The idea of autonomy. How does that relate? You know, do you in terms of community, if there's too much autonomy, isn't everyone in the community doing different things?
Depends what type of things you're talking about.
So,
right?
you know, I understand certain things. We're talking one thing about, you know, whether you hold by Rabbeinu Tam, you know, or, you know, I know there's, you know, and then there's the question of how you observe your Judaism. You know, I understand that that's a wide range.
Right, that
but,
is.
you know, so you say, you know, a place like Efrat or a place like Teaneck or a place like the Upper West Side, what creates, you know, the community of ritual, community of practice? And, you know, and that's an interesting question. The answer is not authority. No one's asking the Gedolim, you know, how they're observing Shabbos at home and Taras Mishpach and those kinds of things. You know, everybody has their own way of dealing with it. But I'm just wondering that the model of autonomy, how that works with kind of a community of ritual, of people more or less doing similar kinds of things, and whether that falls away with too much autonomy.
I think you still have that. I still think, first of all, it's not about ritual only. It's about an ethos, which includes ritual and belief and a way of being.
Right. So
ritual takes
I'm saying
part
that the reason that I'm talking about ritual is because the ethos, you know, the ethics and the belief, so that it's okay if my family has one ethos and the next family, you know, has an ethic. I mean, so you say no, everybody has to be equally moral. But I'm saying just in terms of practice, you know, in terms of ritual, I see kind of a tension if people in the community don't all do more or less the same kind of thing. You don't see that as a problem. Everybody does what they want to do.
I don't think it'll turn out to be hefker. I have faith in people and faith in the Torah and have faith in how it will be interpreted by. There are different types of shilas, right? Certain things I decide for myself. Certain things I look up. Certain things I decide for myself. Certain things I ask people, and very few people have like the one person that they ask. It doesn't work like that anymore, right? So I think that you do have to respect people and say, you know, lo nimnu beit Shammai beit Hillel litchatein zo bezo, even though according to each one had the other one were mamzerim, but somehow they managed. What held them together was more than what divided them, and this is like issues, right?
Okay. So I'm talking here to a group of students who are going to become rabbis. And this, I think, for rabbis, the idea of autonomy, of communal autonomy, really raises a lot of complicated questions, because it really raises the question of what the role of the rabbi is, even in a kind of very 21st century modern idea of the rabbi. What's the role of the rabbi? Is the role of the rabbi to, to encourage autonomy on the part of all the congregants? Is the role of the rabbi to say you have autonomy here but not here?
What's the role of a parent vis-a-vis a child? What do you like? Well, how do you want to educate your child, right? So at certain ages, you just say you can't run into the street, and if you run into the street, I'm going to give you a patch, right? And at other ages, you try to tell them what to do, but they do what they want, right? And other ages, you try to persuade them. This is Moshe Rabbeinu with hitting the seller, talking to the seller. There's no hard and fast answers to that, right? But it has to begin with respect, and it has to begin with enabling other people. I don't like empowering, because then it becomes too ego-centered. But enabling other people, teaching them, helping them, not talking at them and telling them what to do. The high-handed approach.
Okay, let's open it up for, we could go back and forth this for a while. Let's open it up, and, does anybody have any questions? We have just a couple of
Comments
minutes.
is also good.
Comments, yeah.
In the very beginning, when you were talking about submission, I couldn't help. Actually, I think about the Rav's article called "Surrendering to the Almighty." I don't know if you're familiar with it, but I actually read it within the context of my Haredi past life, and it brings examples of like a couple that comes and one of them finds out that they didn't have a firm background, so one is like
Cohen,
yeah. Again, it's just there is still a role for submission in halacha, and there's heartbreak there. Is it just a question of like where that point is on the spectrum?
There is, I think it's a question where the point is at the spectrum. And there might be innovative ways within the interpretive process to find solutions, right? They found solutions for a lot of other things.
Rabbi Hefter,
but you have to relate to each case, right, separately. But
Rabbi Hefter, do you think that the answer can always be yes? Do you think part of the interpretive model is that what we need to do is to find a yes in each case, and it's just a question of how we interpret?
I think it matters how you interpret, and I think with enough ingenuity, I don't think, put it this way, I'll flip it around. I don't think that there has to be a case where there's no to prove that you believe in God. Right? There has to be a case where there's no. I don't think there has to be a case where there's no. Whether it'll always be yes, I can't say. But it doesn't have to be that I have to say no here. Otherwise, it means I don't, because that shows that I don't believe that the Torah comes from God. So I have to show that it's no. That it should never be. Whether, like, theoretically, I don't know. God is great. Allah Akbar. I don't know what's going to be, right?
Okay, well, we can come back to the web take questions, yeah.
I'm restless with a lot of things, even though I appreciate it. I care about a lot of things, trying to take care of the community, and a lot of other autonomous important things that need to be done. But going back to the very beginning, I mean, there was a no. The no was like Hashem said, don't lay your hand on the boy. And where is that? He said don't. In the Akeidah, he told them something that at that time, before Judaism, was very common to kill the children. Very common. Jewish women today, we have to remember and remind each other, and other people, it's not common.
People send their children out to war all the time.
Yes, but they don't think that it's just a wonderful sacrifice to God to do it. There's a willingness to risk life and limb, and the child has to choose it. The parent can't just say, I'm going to enroll you in the army, and then, the child has to say, I'm going to fight for my people, I'm going to defend them, and this and that, and then there's a voice. Hashem gave a voice and said, no, don't do that, don't kill your children anymore. And as Jews, that seems pretty basic. I mean, you can teach your children to be so brave, they're going to stand up against all kinds of things which are Chilul Hashem and risk their life to defend. And yes, that's a value. But the other thing is, you're not allowed to put children to death for the sins of their parents, and you're not allowed to kill your children to Moloch. I don't know why the Muslims don't get it, and I don't know why the Jews aren't getting it. And the idea, like, I'm so restless because we have really important stuff to deal with, and we don't just need to be the middle. I mean, what is this being the middle? The Haredim did something really important that they used to do, to say, for everybody, not just for rich scholars to be a Jew. Now they have their problems with their authority gone wrong. We have our own problems with our authority gone wrong. But don't we have to, like, not just make nice and say, are you asking, that was an interesting question, are you asking people can just do whatever they want
So
to
what
do,
are
or
you,
do we have
are you
faith?
asking, so your comment, is there a specific question?
Oh yeah, what about Judaism moving past where authority or some modern idea for now we don't need authority was the answer? What about being as willing as all the other people were to serve Hashem, but also being willing to hear sometimes no. And as women, can we be different than men? Why do you made it sound as if it's like somehow dishonest to call a woman who's a great Torah scholar, who's ordained from Maharat, something different. I mean, I don't really
If
care.
only
what
if
they
you
call
want to
them.
really call them
But-
something else. If
but
that's what
I'm
you want to
worried,
call them
like-
lechatchila, then that's
But
fine.
I'm worried, like, whatever the people are called when they graduate, and I love this place, I love to study here much more. But I'm not enrolled, so it's not my business to say, but because I'm part of this community, I'm a member of HR, and I'm a Jew, I want to ask, those women who become ordained with Maharat, they should know that basic thing from the Akeidah, be willing to talk to the men about it, and they should be different from the men. And maybe we need rabbis and whatever these women are going to be. Maybe we need both.
Okay.
Instead of just people who are, you guys are like, I feel like you're watering something down. I love that you want people to be honest. It's great. But if we don't even get that first Torah lesson where he said don't kill Yitzchak,
Okay,
what are we here
good,
for?
thanks. I mean, I appreciate that. I mean, that's pushback. We appreciate the comment. That's pushback, to what we're saying. But I think what we're trying to do is, this is the discussion, is to balance these different types of considerations. To be continued, but let's give Leah a chance. Yeah.
I think my question was kind of along the same lines. Like, I guess, I don't know. I like really believe in rules and structure in general, and I'm much more of like a what I do is right and everyone should be like me kind of Jew. And I'm like totally.
And you fit right in.
I know, I do. I mean, that's what I learned, right?
The truth is, I'm like that too.
So
Yeah.
I think you are like that. And that's my question.
How long do we know each other?
No, but I think that like you're a person who's put from just what I know about you, right? Like,
Okay.
you're a person who's put a tremendous amount of thought into how to be a Jew, how to think like a Jew. What are all the composite parts of being a Jew and being a Jewish leader in this world? Like, why should that not be normative? Like, for the amount of brain power that you have poured into that idea, like, why is it okay for someone else who's been around, for me, let's say, who's been around the block for 5 seconds to have my own ideas and not just follow in line behind you? Like, I haven't earned my ideas yet.
I think everybody has to have what they believe with a little bit of humility, right? And that I can, at the same time, believe very strongly what I believe, but I can know that that I have, by virtue of the fact that I'm a human being, I have my limitations, and that somebody else can believe something else, right? So that's where you can have some sort of pluralism, right? Peter Berger, in his book, The Heretical Imperative, talks about this idea of soft certainty, where I realize that the things that I believe are not given to me by something from the outside, but are my interpretation. That necessarily makes them my beliefs firmly held, not absolute truth. It's the most that there is and that I can hope for. So to that extent, I adhere to them and I believe them to be emes, right? But I also recognize that you have your own interpretive process, which you should undertake with humility the way I try to undertake mine with humility, right? And that you can reach different conclusions and hold for them to be equally true and just as strongly as I hold mine. And I have to respect that.
I guess where I'm trying to.
I don't want people to say I'm somech on you.
But I'm trying to trying to figure out what your red line would be. Like, I know you want to say, oh, I don't have red lines, but it just seems to me that someone who spends his entire life engaged with Torah, if I said, well, I'm going to be a good Jew, but I'm leaving the Torah behind, like, that wouldn't be a red line for you. You'd be like, okay, that's your truth, like, fine.
I would think that it's very bad what you're doing, but I would ultimately have to accept it.
You would have to accept it.
I would have to accept it because you're a human being and you made an autonomous choice. I would have to accept it. I wouldn't have to be happy about it, but I would have to accept it.
And you don't think I need to care about your opinion?
Well, if the choice that you made was properly considered, and if it was necessary for you to take my opinion into consideration, if I was your father or something, right? So then I would hope that you took that into your consideration. But I can't control that either. And the truth, nor do I want to. The truth is, right? So I don't want to. So my wife says I shouldn't go into kiruv because you don't want to be friends. Like, don't be friends. But it would make me, if it was my child, I would be disappointed, and I would be disappointed. And as much as I know you, if you told me that, I would be disappointed in you, right? And you would have to live with that, whatever that means for you, right? And that would have to go into your chulent of like what goes into your considerations when you make your autonomous choice.
Yeah.
So I just want to move the discussion back a little bit to specifically smicha for women. When you were talking about it, how you wanted to bring the Akeidah into that conversation, you gave us two models of looking at the Akeidah. One was submission versus autonomy, and one was religion versus morality. And both of those you discussed in the context of Akeidah and what that means. I'm kind of wondering two things. Number one is, how do you view the Orthodox community's view of smicha for women? Does it fit into one of those two conversations? Do you feel that the resistance to smicha for women falls into one of those categories? Is the conversation about submission versus autonomy, or is it about morality versus religion? And then my second question is, how
I think that's also the same thing.
Well, kind of not the way that you framed
Yeah.
it.
But I don't see those two things as separate. There's the interior and the exterior, and there's what you believe to be right by virtue of your by introspection that you've done and talking to other by outside confirmation and internal introspection. Right? That's one thing. It's the I see if that's what you mean by autonomy, then yeah.
Well, I'm just wondering, where do you feel that the resistance to granting women smicha from the Orthodox community as a whole, from the Haredi community, or from the non?
You're asking me a sociological question about a community that I don't live in.
Is it coming from one of those places that you discussed? Like, are there people that view it and say, well, it might be halachic, but it's not moral? Or is it
Nobody thinks it's immoral. They think that it's not the Masoret. And then you get to this thing about the Masoret has authority over what you might think is right.
So
right?
that's what I was wondering.
So I think
that
that's, look, some of it is just, male clubbiness that, we have the authority, but nobody will say that part of it. But the way shuls are, is it's very visceral, the way people like it the way they were brought up.
Yeah.
People like it the way they were brought up. L'tov v'l'ra. Right? That's the way people like it, right? I mean, I've davened in partnership minyanim, but I don't feel comfortable, but I wasn't brought up that way. But I would shed my last drop of blood that if somebody wants to daven that way, they should daven that way, right? And I've davened, right? So because that's how I was brought up. So I just have to recognize that there are certain type of things that talk to you for other reasons. So people are repressing that, and they have to turn it into emes as opposed to the way I was brought up, right? So that's where you get the problem. Then it becomes a problem. Where's the authority? And is this orthodox? I mean, it doesn't say orthodoxy any place in the Shulchan Aruch, right? It says Torah, mitzvahs, yirat shamayim. right?
It's a great word.
Whatever. So this obsession with, because it has to do with the difference between American Jewry and Israeli Jewry. That in America you live in a sea of non-Jews. You have to define your denomination, right? In Israel, the whole sea is Jews. So they don't have this obsession with defining, are you Orthodox or you're not Orthodox. Dati lo dati is very different than Orthodox or not Orthodox. Right?
So let me follow up, and then we'll take the question. That last little point really kind of, I think, talks to the whole discussion today. And that is that the situation in America is really different than the situation you're describing. Because in America, to be Orthodox, and Orthodox is a social club, if you want to be part of that social club, you need to fit into that social club. And the question is, at what point, if you fall out of that social club, and that social club is not redefining itself for the 21st century, obviously. That social club is back whenever it is, right? Let's say that social club of American Orthodoxy.
Or because of the dissonance that's created by the 21st century, the social club becomes more and more hollow of meaning. And becomes more and more.
Clarification, what do you guys mean by social club?
Social club means
It's
it's
a
not
sociological group.
Sociological group means it's not Torah mitzvahs. Okay, that's what we mean. Sociological group, social club, right? It's not about Torah mitzvahs. It's not about if you could explain to me that this is Torah mitzvahs that it's okay. It's a sociological group which is defined basically, you're right, by its association with the outside world, which is both non-Jews and the conservative movement. Right? Now, but if you can fit into that sociological group, then you can't get to first base, meaning that you can't have impact as leaders if you're not accepted within that group. And that, I think, in America is an extremely important question. And that goes back to the terminology of what you call maharats, meaning you're 100% right. But if calling a woman rabbi something other than rabbi is going to allow you to get to first base, it might be worth it to get to first base so that you then can go around the rest of the bases. Because if you call them rabbi and therefore you can't get to first base.
Okay, let me use your metaphor. Okay. What stadium are you playing in?
Yeah, okay.
Okay, who's in the bleachers, right? Is it just the rest of the Orthodox community,
Or
the
everybody.
bleachers everybody? And if the bleachers is everybody, then your argument is much less persuasive.
Good, I accept that, but that's a big jump in America to say that I don't care about that sociological group because 90%, I'm making it up, but let's say 90% of American Jews are not connected to Orthodoxy, and therefore I just can't worry about whether or not I'm defined within that sociological group. My responsibility is to the 90%, not just to that little group who is defining the rules of baseball for us. But somehow that's going to require a community for which, as leaders, that we are going to be able to be part of. If the minute you fall out of that sociological group and you worry about the 90%, but if the 90% won't place you in a position of leadership, so then that's a problem. And this is Dan Smokler's thing. I mean, I can't even begin to discuss this, but this is the question of, maybe we do better in a Hillel setting, in a non-Orthodox setting, in a broader setting, rather than thinking that the role of the rabbi is to be within that sociological group. And, I think that's all around what you're talking about.
I'm going to say that I'm out of my depth here because I'm not a sociologist of American Jewry, right? So I don't know. So maybe Hillel's is better than you got to sit here with your sociologists and talk about how you're going to tactically make the biggest impact. But I think that people who are essentially modern in their outlook are relieved when the Torah speaks the truth to them. And that is what ultimately is redemptive. Other things are Chilul Hashem, and it ultimately pushes people. I'm not talking about the leadership. You have to shoot over the heads of the leadership that are afraid for justified reasons, for not justified reasons. I really feel bad for them. That's the truth. Mamish feel bad for them. It's that they're afraid. They walk around and they're afraid. I just feel bad for them. Just love the Torah, love what you're teaching, and it'll be okay. I believe that. So what's the best way to teach that? So whether you teach it in Hillel, or you teach it in online, or however you do it, so do it already.
Feeling bad for the leadership isn't a strategy.
No, I wasn't saying it. No, you're the historian of American
No, I'm
Jews.
saying
that's your responsibility. I'm just telling you how I feel.
But you know,
I have
talk
the
about
luxury, 'cause I live in Israel.
halacha for 1 second, then we're going to finish
Okay.
because it's 5 o'clock. Talk about about this kind of approach. To Rabbi Schechter's article against women rabbis or partnership minyanim or whatever it is says it's because it's going to become like the conservative movement. So I agree with you.
That's
I
the
feel
bottom of the
badly.
slippery slope.
So I'm saying I feel badly for that leadership. So I'm totally in agreement with you that I feel badly for that leadership. Now, but to be a leader, so the minute that someone chooses to be a leader in a partnership minyan or in Yeshivat Maharat or whatever he was attacking, means that leadership is outside of the sociological group that he defines. I'm not getting involved in what that social group is, whatever. So you're saying you have to jump over the leadership. So right. So I think this is something you're talking about. You're saying you speak truth to power, and that people feel
Truth
free.
again.
Okay, people feel
Speak passion to power.
passion to power, okay? People feel liberated
That's my experience.
with honesty. Okay? People feel liberated with honesty. People either feel liberated by honesty or scared to death.
Okay, so what are you gonna do? You're gonna live your life because other people are scared?
But I think that
The question is, like, what is your, or look, it's a dangerous world out there, right? Okay, we know it's a dangerous world. The Middle East is more dangerous than most places, but it's dangerous to all sorts of hazards, right? So there's not that the people that are afraid are psychotic. They're not psychotic. They're not like, they don't have, they're seeing visions of people wanting to kill them, right? But the question is whether fear becomes your orienting experience. Fine, so there's things to be afraid of, okay? And there's things to be excited about. And there's things that you want to teach. And there's things to be afraid of. Or I'm afraid, and that orients everything I do. So that's the question. So I don't think that fear should be the orienting thing.
Okay.
If there's kfira today, I don't like talking in terms of kfira, but if there's kfira, it's fear. Because it means you don't trust the Torah.
Yeah, the question is how to fight it. Well, next time, to be continued
Next
next
time.
time. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very
Rabbi
much.
Hester.
Thank you.
Repeat the